You know, people say about religion, they say, oh, this is more the Western world. I don't know how you have it here, but they say, you know, religion, oh, religion makes everybody like sheep, all the same, running the same direction, doing the same thing. There's no individual part to it. And that's really nonsense. It's the non-religious people that are all doing the same thing and looking to see if their labels are the same and watching the same football game, and they're the ones that are the sheep. If you think of true religion, I mean, I think of the hands of the cause. After the passing of the beloved guardian, the hands in conclave said they asked themselves, what makes a hand of the cause? What is it that we all have in common that the guardian appointed us as hands of the cause? And they couldn't come up with anything. Everybody was so different. You think of the hands, each one of them is so distinct. They finally came up with, we all are devoted to the beloved guardian. We do whatever the guardian calls upon us to do, we will arise and do that. Well, that was the thing that made them different in a very special way. Likewise, all of us as Baha'is, if we arise to serve the cause the way the cause calls for, our individuality starts arising in us, because our distinction, our individual reality, is a certain spectrum of divine names, all the names and attributes of God, but in different proportions in each of us. So much so that seeing another Baha'i reveals a facet of divinity that you didn't know about. When they're awakened spiritually, they provide you with some element, some cut of the diamond of reality, of human reality that we didn't know about. And when the Baha'is are not intending, let us say, because I think we all want spiritual rebirth, but when we're not in directing ourselves that way, then those qualities don't shine, then the common qualities of humanity interfere. But the hands of the cause, as you know, how many of you have met or seen one hand of the cause? Are there people here, I'm sure, that still look? Okay. Okay, so now you turn to your neighbor who hasn't and tell them about the hands of the cause. That'll finish the meeting. That's based on a Mullah Nasruddin story, you know. Mullah Nasruddin went to a meeting and he said, so, how many of you know what I'm going to say? Half of the people raised their hand. He said, okay, how many don't know what I'm going to say? And the other half raised their hand. So he said, okay, the first half should tell the second half what I'm going to say. Good night. Look, I don't know which hands of the cause you've seen. I think Dr. Muhajir seems to be the head of the Malaysia activity group. I've had the bounty of meeting Dr. Muhajir many times, both in the Holy Land and also in the field. In Central America, he came when I was pioneering in the rainforests of Nicaragua, and he came to visit there, and we went by canoe on the open sea with sharks around, and oh my goodness, visited and opened villages to the faith. We arrived in one village setting, a remote setting. They don't have visitors very often, but they got visitors. We came. And they said, who are you? And he said, I'm the doctor. And he said, go tell the people to come out of the river. They were all up the river with their plantations and things. So it took a day. They all came down by canoe, and we had a big gathering. This place had more bugs than any place I've ever been in my life. It wasn't a place where you hit the bugs. You wiped them, you just wiped them off it. And the people would usually, when they wanted to sit together, talk together, they made a fire and let the smoke come in the air, and the smoke kept the bugs off. So I remember this particular day, there were just so many bugs. We made a fire, we had some smoke, and still the people all had rags, and they were going with the rags like this, you know. Well, it was the first time I ever saw the friends saying remover of difficulties with the rag. Is there any remover of difficulties? And then the hand of the cause spoke to them. The particular tribe wasn't very musical. He wanted them to sing. I think the best we got for Alauapa was Alfafafa. Alfafafa, Alfafafa. And he looked, he'd scratch his head like, you know. So he said, well, what can I tell you? Our message is the same as this fire. What? Yes, he said, you see, it has made of 3 logs. If the logs are together, if they're sticking together, the flame is there. If they pull back, if they're not united, it starts smoking and it hurts your eyes. That's what Baha'u'llah has come to tell us. We should all be very close together, not like the fire that has smoke. And then I'm trying to translate into a kind of pidgin English. This was a pidgin English that if you wanted to say Baha'u'llah, you said Baha'u'llah. Him one man got plenty light in the face. That was an explanation of Baha'u'llah. Him one man got plenty light in the face. Glory of God. Then Dr. Muhajir said, you know what's happened? He said, you're all one family. We're all one family. We were all on the river, living up in the river. We were one family together. And God sent everything we needed. We had food, we ate, and we multiplied and became children until some of the children would go out and hunt and come back. Or they go out and plant and come back on the river, up and down the river. All right, then he said, then the next stage, what happened? He said it was farther and farther. They went to hunt and to come back. Then finally they built a little house at that place and they stayed there. And they would come back once in a while. Then they went all the way down the river to the ocean. And they went along the shores of the ocean. And they settled. And he said, you know what? They forgot they were from one place. They forgot they were one family. Now Baha'u'llah has come back to say, you people who've moved all over, you see all over, we're all people. We are all one family. We're all brothers and sisters. So they asked who liked that. Everybody said they liked that. He told them a few more things. And they sang Alfafafa a few times. And then he said, okay, this village is ready. That's fine. But we tried to teach remover of difficulties. I remember on the second visit back to the village, there had been an accident. A lady had been caught under a tree that had fallen down. And they explained to us how they used the prayers, the doctor's prayers they used for the lady. Well, what was the prayer you used? They said, is there any remover? Is there any remover? Is there any remover? That was the prayer. And we got the lady out, they said. Dr. Muhajir wanted to go on to another country. And there was a canoe going away. And he said, I'm going on the canoe. Hooper, he said, you go to the next 2 villages. And he said, don't come back until they're Baha'is. This was a very remote area. Dear Dr. Muhajir was there, and I also met him in the Andes. In the Andes, he was in Lima, Peru. We had a meeting of the counselors, and Dr. Muhajir was there, and he had a a meeting, a press meeting, and after that he had a public meeting. In the public meeting, he gave a brilliant talk, 20-minute talk, such a fresh vision of the faith, but exactly the same thing of the faith, but in such a fresh way. I was just amazed. And the audience was completely, you know how sometimes the audience is like it turns to cream. They hear this message and they just sit there, kind of they're just absorbing it, They don't have any questions or concerns. But the chairman of the NSA, he was saying, will Dr. Mahathir take questions? Can we have questions and answers? So I didn't like the idea myself because I thought this has gone so well. We don't want to make a mess here. And asked Dr. Mahathir, he said, okay, if they want questions, all right, questions and answers. He really answered everything when the talk was so brilliant. So we said, any questions? And there was a man in the third row with a very large red nose. And this red-nosed man, he said, what about wine? That was the question. What about it? So I translated for the hand of the cause. Oh, he said, thank you for that question. That's a very useful question. Very important question, he said. The Bahai writings are full of wine, mentions of wine everywhere in the Bahai writings. The Bahai writings talk about the wine of the glory of God, the wine of astonishment, the wine of understanding, the wine. He said, all kinds of wine. He said, if you can partake, if you can drink of this wine, you'll forget the other one. Next question. So I had such a way, a spontaneous way, as you know, of dealing with the writings and everything. This was wonderful. I'm going to lose control of this California time system here. What is this? Okay. I wanted to tell you, I worked under the hand of the cause, Jalal Qazi. Jalal Qazi, I don't know if he ever got here or not. Did he? I don't know if he came to Southeast Asia, but he was a colonel in the army and dealt with tribal peoples in Iran. And the Guardian had suspended pilgrimage. The questions of the combined difficult questions, friends, from 41 until 51. The violation of the covenant by the Guardian's family, which was so painful to the Guardian and it's so difficult. The World War, and finally the resolution and birth, the War of Independence of Israel, during which a very close confidant of the Guardian that helped at the master's house in the garden and so on, was shot crossing the street by a sniper, to the Guardian's great grief. I think that might have been one of the final personal calamities he had that left him isolated completely. Maria Khanum told us, she said, to tell you, for 10 years, I never saw the Guardian smile. 41 to 51 was such a difficult period. And it was overshadowed by the sadness that it brought about because of the violation of his family. During that time, and just after that period, he buried his mother and his father with no announcement to the Baha'i world. Any little lady died in an island somewhere, it was a wonderful message. His mother died, not a word to the world. You can imagine the pain of that. He's put them in graves with initials rather than the names on the graves. In any case, in 51, the African campaign began. It was the first international campaign of the cause, and it had combined the efforts of Northeast Africa, the British NSA, the American NSA, and the Iranian NSA. These 4 NSAs had goals for a 2-year period. And not long after the first pioneers arrived in their goals, particularly through the efforts of Ali Nakhchivan, the tribal peoples in Uganda began entering the cause in large numbers. And this brought such joy and promise to the Guardian's heart. This is the reason Rehoboam said that in the Guardian's monument in London, the continent of Africa, you see it when you're at the threshold facing the Holy Land, you see Africa, because she felt that was significant because of how that changed. And also, with those circumstances, the Guardian opened once again the door of pilgrimage, which had been shut for a whole decade. There were occasional visitors who came on ships or military people, different ones that managed to visit Haifa, but very few during those 10 years. And the announcement went to Iran that the pilgrimage was open again. And Mr. Qadem, who was later to be named a Hand of the Cause, a member of the National Assembly in Iran, was coming on pilgrimage. And Mr. Kaze, Colonel Kaze, had also wanted to come to the Holy Land. He told me this story himself. He said, I wanted to go to the Holy Land, but I went and I spoke to Mr. Furatan and to the hands that had just been appointed. And I said, you know, I want to go, but I'm a little afraid. I hear these rumors that Shoghi Effendi reads your heart and he knows everything that's in your mind. And he said, I have a kind of interesting background, and I don't know what might come in my head at some moment that I would rather the Guardian wouldn't know about. So should I go or should I not go? And they said, well, maybe you should go and take your chances. It's important to be a pilgrim. So he said, Mr. Kaze said, I joined Mr. Qadem. We were the 2 first Eastern pilgrims after this 10-year period to reach the Holy Land. Okay. They stayed in the Eastern Pilgrim House, which is the pilgrim house that is up on the mountain near the shrine. And the Guardian's custom was to drive in a car up there. He would be driven in his car and let off there in front of the pilgrim house. Then the pilgrims would stand and wait for him, and he would move with them to the shrines. Every day he did this. Then he'd go down and he'd meet with Rehoboam with the Iranian women, if there happened to be any Iranian. There weren't on this occasion, there weren't any Iranian women. And then he would meet the Western pilgrims at the supper table, at the dinner table, in the Western Pilgrim House, which was down across the street from the Master, which became the first seat of the Universal House of Justice. So Mr. Kaze said we arrived, and we were so pleased to meet the Guardian, and he was leading the way to the shrines, and he was talking about different subjects. And he came to the subject of Mr. Qadem's services. And he said, just as we arrived to the white marble steps, he turned to Mr. Qadem and praised him for his services, for his wonderful services to the cause. And Mr. Qadem fainted onto the ground, out cold. So the Guardian was very concerned. The Guardian got down on his knees and picked up Mr. Qadem's head and had it there and was patting his face to wake him up. And Mr. Qadem woke up and he saw the Guardian's face that far from his face, and he fainted again. Mr. Kazi was wondering what's going to happen. We can't wake Mr. Qadem up, you know. Anyway, then they gradually, he got control of his emotions. They got him on his feet and we continued to the shrine. All right, that's fine. And it was the custom of the guardian to visit with the pilgrims one of the two shrines, either the shrine of the Bab or the shrine of Abdu'l-Baha. So this was the first visit. One day they visited the shrine of the Bab, and the next day they visited the shrine of Abdu'l-Baha. So that was those days. Now we visit both shrines, and we visit from both sides. It's quite changed from the earlier times. We came to the shrines, Mr. Kaze said, we came to the shrines, and the guardian went forward to the threshold, and the two of us came in, and one of us went to each side, just by the curtains in the back of the shrine room, you know, looking to the threshold. And Shoghi Effendi walked forward to the threshold, and he started chanting the tablet of visitation. Can you imagine, friends, going to the shrine of the Bab and hearing the sign of God on earth addressing his maker? My God. Profound experience that they had. I remember hearing Mr. Khadim say at another occasion that the guardian it was so intense what he was doing that he had a certain movement to his shoulder as he was chanting. But it just seemed to be reflective of the intensity of his devotion. He finished the tablet of visitation and he moved to the threshold of the shrine of the Bab, and he prostrated himself there. And after a time, he rose, and out of respect for the shrine, he backed towards. He didn't turn his back to the shrine. He backed out of the shrine. Now, at that point, he said, the guardian was coming between us. We were standing on both sides, and the guardian's coming between us. We looked at each other like, do we turn to the guardian as he's going out, or do we continue to face the threshold? Well, Mr. Kazi said, I am, you know, fairly corpulent, fairly large-bodied man. So he said, the best I could do was I half-halved it, half to the guardian and half to the threshold. Then the guardian went out, so then we went forward to the shrine and we said our prayers, and then we backed out of the shrine. And as we came out, Shoghi Effendi had put his shoes on already, and he was pacing up and down rather seriously. And then he said, you know, the station of the shrine is very great. He said, the friends don't understand the station of the shrine. He said, we knew which friends he was talking about. That was clear. Then we put our shoes on, and he began quoting from the writings about the history of the shrine, about the character of the shrine. And we were listening and following behind him. We turned the front corner of the shrine, and we were in the open part facing Baji. And Mr. Kazi said, the guardian, clearly he said that the holy reality of the Bab here in this shrine is being circled around by all the prophets and messengers of the past. They're circling in adoration. And he said, when he said that, without wanting or meaning anything, he said, into my mind it came to me, my goodness, what's left for Baha'u'llah if everybody's here? The guardian was walking ahead of us. He stopped, turned, looked directly to me, and he smiled. And then he said, and then the Bab and all those that circle around him circle around Baha'u'llah at Baji. Now he says, Mr. Kazi said, did he know what I was thinking or didn't know what I was thinking? He couldn't tell. He said, obviously he was answering my question. After that, he said, I was very cautious as I could be about what I was thinking. It's a lovely story about the reality of the shrines. You know, the explanation sometimes the hands would give to the pilgrims before they went to the shrines. You know, everyone's different. Some of us come with such anxiety about, are we going to feel something or are we going to feel the right way at the shrine, that they block any feelings that they have. And they would say, don't judge the shrine by the first visit if you don't feel anything, because next to you are a couple of Persians that are bawling their eyes out, and you think to yourself, I'm completely unspiritual. They're so spiritual, and I'm just like a rock. And then they would get so sad. So we tried to cheer them up and say, give it a little time. You know, you're coming several times. And usually the friends, then they would have some experience, either at Baji or the Shrine of the Bab, where they were able to empty themselves and feel the great power of the shrine. The power of the shrines, which had its own, many of you, how many of you have been pilgrimage to the Holy Land? Pilgrimages sometime. Look at this, that's wonderful. My goodness. Mubarak Bashi. Blessings on you. So this was the experience that I had with the Hand of the Cause, Mr. Kazi. He directed our operations in South America. He was the resident hand after the passing of the Guardian, after the election of the House of Justice. He came and he was 5 years in South America. And it was the end of those 5 years he returned back. He had been a hand in the Holy Land prior to that. He returned back to Iran. One of the things that he did after his pilgrimage was the Guardian said you should visit all the Baha'i localities in Iran. Well, there were, I don't know, 300 and some localities. It was a big job. He had to give up his work and go and with different modes of travel and stay with the friends in these different places. And he woke a great spirit with his stories about the Guardian and the Holy Land and his own inimitable way of teaching. He was a storyteller, but a very exacting, detailed storyteller. And he'd gradually lead the listener to a certain place, and then he'd reveal the point of what he was making. And it was always so powerful. We saw him do this in Bolivia and in Chile, Argentina. The wonderful memories of a man. Friends, how can I tell you about Mr. Olinga? I think he came here briefly. I traveled with him originally after the house, the hands had sent him in 1961 as the representative of the World Center for the formation of the new National Spiritual Assembly of Cuba and Panama. Now, at that time, Americans and some of the Europeans couldn't even get into Cuba. But Mr. Olinga, coming from Africa, was welcome, and he was able to go. I met him first in Panama after the convention there, and visited briefly. I had the one day, and a group of us took Mr. Olinga to see the canal, the Panama canals, and how that operated. And in that period of time, he began talking about his pilgrimage that he had made to the Holy Land in the time of the Guardian. And as a pioneer, as a knight of Baha'u'llah from the Cameroon, from the Western Cameroon. He had arisen, the Guardian called on the friends in Africa to arise to fulfill the goals, the virgin goals of Africa. And a number of them arose, and the Naqshbandis drove them across Africa to the goals in West Africa. And they left Mr. Olinga in the Cameroons. And he began his services there. Within the first year, he had 100 new Baha'is. And He himself told me that he had the most extraordinary experiences. One thing he said, numerous evenings he said, he would come exhausted back home and fall asleep, and two angelic beings would come to him and raise him up, and they would ascend through elevators of glass and light into the higher realms. And they would come out into these realms, and one particular one, he said, they would take me to these gatherings, which were like a coliseum, and all the people were seated around the souls of those that had passed on, living in the next world. He said they were seated around this light, a combination of like water and light that was pulsating with different colors. And he said that pulsation, with each pulsation, the soul was filled with new knowledge. Well, the hair on my head was standing up in the back of my head. I was wondering, what am I hearing here? And every subsequent encounter with Mr. Olinga, there were more marvels to be heard. When he spoke to the believers about the soul, particularly young people, about the soul and the qualities of faith and spiritual rebirth, they were the deepest things that I have heard anywhere. And the hands all were inspiring. They all had this gift of the confirmations of the Holy Spirit, for sure. But the content I found in the long term, and this is maybe because of more exposure to Mr. Olinga than to the other hands. Of course, I had a long association with the hands in the teaching center, but before that, in the field, the second time I met Mr. Olinga, I was a counselor in South America, and he arrived and needed to have someone to accompany him and translate and arrange exchange of money and tickets. It's all very complicated in a foreign language. So I was with him for 3 months and translated all of his conversations and all of his talks. What a range of spiritual insight and vision that he had. What a happy soul he was. How he inspired people everywhere he went. The trip was not an easy trip. Sometimes we were on the back of trucks that are loaded with goods too high to enable you to hold onto this side of the truck. You're just barely balanced on top of this whizzing around mountain roads in the highlands of Bolivia. 4,000 meters, 5,000 meters. Friends, I wanted Mr. Olinga to sleep in a hotel one night. We'd had such a hard time. We went to Potosi in Bolivia and got a hotel room for him, and I had a room. And in the morning I met him and asked him how he was. Did he sleep all right? He said, I was afraid, he said, to lie down. Potosi is 5,000 meters in the air. The next day we were off to a village which was in that altitude of Quechuan Indians, Quechuan-speaking Indians, the descendants of the Inca Empire. The descendants of the Inca Empire, they had extraordinary prophecies. They had prophecies of a soul who would come named Viracocha. He was the promised one who would connect them with all the tribes of the world. The prophecies of Viracocha said that the ones that came to teach them from God, to teach them these things, to unite them with the rest of their brothers around the world, would have hair on their faces. Now, the Indians didn't have any facial hair at all. When the Spaniard arrived, Pizarro and his army, navy, whatever you want to call it, on these ships, the Quechuan people saw them with these beards on their faces and said, oh, these are the fulfillment of the prophecies of Viracocha. And they came and they brought gold figurines and food and everything and bowed down before them. Well, the Spaniards were very happy about that. They just took over the whole country and everything. And now it took several hundred years before they saw the photo of Abdu'l-Baha and began recognizing that Baha'u'llah was the promised one that they were expecting. And that spread like wildfire also in the villages. So Mr. Olinga, we were in a village and in a little stone hut, which was the schoolhouse of the village. And he tried to say, like, to understand how he could deliver a meeting to these people, which he would say something in English, I would translate it to Spanish, it would be translated to Quechua and then into Aymara. So almost anything you said was going through these multiple stages. So he very simply shared his love with the people and the wonder that they had embraced the faith in this very remote, high village. And he said, he talked to them, you've heard of the House of Justice? They said, yes. He said, all right, let us all stand and turn to the Holy Land and repeat Allah Pa for each member of the House of Justice and connect with them in that way. And you know, this happened, and we all said Allah Pa 9 times together. It's an amazing kind of way of connecting the friends with the World Center at that time. We came out of that village and we were on top of a truck filled with coca leaves and some animals, and it was racing down a hill to the town of Oruro. In Oruro, we had had an appointment that day, we weren't sure of the timing, to visit the university, for Mr. Olinga to meet the rector of the university. This was in the high altiplano of Bolivia. We came down 2.5 hours of driving on this dusty road. We were completely covered with dust. We arrived at the entrance to the university. The rector of the university, the head of the university, came out and he said, oh, I'm so glad you arrived. We have the whole meeting set up. There's several hundred people in the hall waiting to hear you give a talk on science and religion. And we're going to start right now. So we beat ourselves with towels and things to get the dust off us and went inside, and he said, oh yes, and because there was such interest, the national broadcasting company is there. They're going to broadcast your talk to the whole country. I thought, Mr. Olinga, you know, there wasn't time to do anything, believe me. We just went straight to the auditorium and onto the platform. And with this nobility that he had a different way with each audience, but he had this nobility. He rose up and he gave this splendid talk about science and religion. My goodness. I was taking some notes, and about halfway through I said, okay, he's memorized talk of Abdu'l-Baha about science and religion, and he's memorized it and he's giving it because it's so perfect, it has to be that. Well, I could never find that talk. But Mr. Olinga said that during his pilgrimage, Shoghi Effendi had stressed to him that the best way to teach the faith is the model of Abdu'l-Baha's talks from the West. And you must master that form of speaking. And he did that. He had this way. So afterwards, people would ask if he was a king from Africa. They're just spontaneously the different places that would happen. In one town, we got off of a bus, Children rushed to him from all sides. He's just like a magnet to children. He had maybe 10 or 12 children. This was in Ecuador, on each hand. And the crowd, the people couldn't get off the bus because he'd just gotten off and it was congested. So he went off into the street and he started walking down the street. And people saw this is some event that's happening and rushed out. There were soon 200 people following him, with him down the street, and he was waving to the people in the houses on the side of the road, and they said, this is he's an African king, he's come. They had African descent people mixed in the population as had been slaves earlier, but they were there. That evening there was a meeting and 40 people embraced the faith after his talk about the cause. Such a clear, lucid presentation of the faith. He would stress with the youth, you must learn the method of Abdu'l-Baha. Now Shoghi Effendi in several letters has written to Western Baha'is and groups of youth, concentrate and absorb the method of the Master when he spoke in the West. Friends, if you look carefully, he addressed things in a way that it's still applicable. The materialism, the traditional following of past religions, the nature of civilization, the character of man, all of it is laid out by Abdu'l-Baha. Mr. Linga said that when he was in the presence of the Guardian said that I'm putting you in the Eastern Pilgrim House. Here's an English-speaking African, but he's not a Westerner in the sense of the other white Westerners that had come from Europe and everything. So he put him in the Eastern Pilgrim House. There were no pilgrims at that time in the Eastern Pilgrim House. And he said, Lutfullah Hakim will take care of you while you're there. So Lutfullah Hakim was preparing meals and taking care of Mr. Olinga, and the Guardian, as was his custom, he came in the car and alone with Mr. Olinga would walk every afternoon in the gardens and take him to the shrine and talk to him. Mr. Olinga was not an immodest person. He was very modest. But he said, and he just said it so clearly, he said, and Shoghi Effendi taught me all things. Wow. He said, I want you to come to the Master's house in the mornings, 10 o'clock, and we can talk together again, day by day. As far as I know from the testimony of the World Center, this Rahil Khanum, they never heard of the Guardian treating any pilgrim that way. He would meet with the meetings, but here he had him alone in the afternoon and the evenings, and then he would have him in the morning in the house. He said, he spoke to me about so many different subjects. One of the things he said, I've repeated, this is, you have to take it as a pilgrim note. We don't have it in a text. But he said that the Master on more than one occasion, Abdu'l-Bahas, had Shoghi Effendi reported to Mr. Olinga that this planet is the tail of the dog, the lowest, most backward planet of our solar system. And that now is the first step towards civilization, towards the maturing of us to the point we will be able to then associate later with the other planets. And he said, a manifestation of God will come at the end of this cycle to unite our planetary system in one single civilization. Wow. I tell you that because it kind of opens the vision. We say, well, we've reached the highest stage of development on this planet, which is international unity. Now we have another, after that we'll have more things to do. Meanwhile, let's get the plan done and the things we have to do locally. And I think that's why Shoghi Effendi didn't speak about these things openly with all the believers. There are several sets of pilgrim notes of people serving at the World Center, helping the Guardian, confirming this same kind of statements. it's quite interesting to us I think, just to have that, where I think the gentleman was telling us, the place where you put some knowledge you're not sure about, but it's interesting to remember. That seems to be a good category, a good place for pilgrim notes. Friends, the vision of Mr. Olenga, his dedication, was just out of this world. I don't know, was he here many days in, do you remember, Lily, was he here? He visited here and spoke to the friends? Yes. So you have a terrific heritage of Hands of the Cause, visits from Hands of the Cause. Friends, Amatul Baha Ruhollah Khanum was extraordinary Baha'i, as you know. Just to have to live on in this world after the death of, after having had those decades with Shoghi Effendi as his helpmate, as his companion, as his consort, to then have to separate, have to go on and serve the cause after that was very painful, very difficult. She was a pillar of strength, you know, until after the funeral and after the conclave, and then she just was in such grief. You felt always there was this bittersweet, as happy as she could be and serving and so on. She said, Shoghi Effendi, when I was with him one time in the 40s, he said to me, what will you do after I pass? And she said, oh, I was alarmed, so much alarmed at such a question. And she said, oh, Shoghi Effendi, don't talk about your passing or so on. He said, no, what will you do? He said, you will travel the world around and carry the faith and the fragrance of the faith to the friends everywhere. And she really outshone, she even outshone Martha Root in the sense of the number of countries that she visited. I took her on a trip I had. She said to me in a visit after the dedication of the Panama Temple, I didn't know her very well at that time, but she had been following my work with the Indian peoples because I'd been going visiting many Indian tribes and things, and she was interested in that. And she said when she came to Argentina, I want to go somewhere where the Baha'is have never been, a tribal area where the Baha'is have never been. I thought, oh, okay. And we went north into the Chaco, a remote thorn forest of dirt paths, and we went for several days, and we arrived at the Pilcomayo River, which is a river between Argentina and Paraguay. Very remote. The people live off of what they call algarrobo. It's a kind of a grain, a seed pod that grows on these dry trees. And they would eat, some of them would eat lizards and rabbits, and it was a very primitive area. I think we subsisted on crackers and a couple of watermelon that we had and a couple of cans of tuna fish. Finally, one village that we went to where she proclaimed the faith, we had with us Mataco Indians so that they knew the language, they could translate for her, and she gave these talks. And they had her sleep in an animal shelter. They had no shelters of their own. They mostly slept in what were called wickiups, so kind of sticks with some cloth over the top. And that night it rained, and all of us, the travel teachers, were out in the rain. And she said, you have to come in here with us. She was with her cousin. And we all slept under this small roof with this pouring rain, which filled up the forest, the thorn forest, filled up with water and mud. And then we had to drive out of that, and the vehicle never made it out. We finally had to walk out miles and miles and bring back a tractor with a coupling, and on the coupling was like a flatbed where all of us were able to hold on, and they pulled us out of this place. The truck itself had gone into an ant hole, so it about halfway submerged into the water, and the water was coming in the cabin. And Rihakhanum had an agouti with her, which was a rodent from the forest of Panama that she'd been given as a gift, and which she was quite taken with. And this little creature, who I got to know several times because it would escape from time to time, and Rihakhanum would send me off to chase it and bring it back, which I just, with the greatest name, I would leap on top of this thing. Had a rhinestone necklace and was walked on a leash in the cities. Extraordinary vision. That was a very difficult. We took some photographs. In the photographs, her cousin and myself and several of the Indian friends that were with us are standing in what looks like standing in a mud puddle with mud up to above our ankles, and you think to yourself, why are they standing in that mud puddle? But the mud puddle was 60 miles of 60 kilometers, if you will, of mud puddle was going out in all directions. And Rihakhanum, in later years when we were in the Holy Land, in dinner parties, where everyone was being very respectful of her presence and waiting on whatever she would want to tell the group, from time to time she'd choose to say, in the after-dinner period of the evening, that man, and she'd point to me, took me on the worst trip of my life. So I wasn't in a position to remind her that she said, please take me where the Baha'is have never been. But that was what it was. And about the time people were thinking, my God, they looked at me like, he's going to shrivel up and die. How can anybody take this attack from Rihakhanum? Then she would sweeten the air with a smile and a glorious, radiant look on her face, and she said, and it was the best trip I ever took as well. So she'd fix it that way. So I think that little trip is probably the cause of our having gone to the Holy Land. Though the House of Justice chose us to come to the Teaching Center, she knew what kind of experiences that all of us had had together. It was a wonderful time. And the other hands of the cause we heard, they came to the Holy Land. Mr. Haney was an extraordinary soul. He was one of the 4 hands of the cause on the Teaching Center. The core of the Teaching Center was Rihakhanum, Mr. Furatan, Mr. Faizi, and Mr. Haney, and 3 counselors. Mr. Yazdi, who you heard about in the last presentation, was one of the 3 counselors. Mrs. Mayberry from the United States, and myself from South America. And we had the opportunities, when the hands would come to the Holy Land, they would also meet with the Teaching Center as part of the Teaching Center. And in 1978, they had their last conclave of the hands of the cause that were still alive. I think maybe 15 hands came. And the dear hands, they said that the 3 counselors were now doing the work of the hands in the Teaching Center. You should come to the conclave. And 3 of us were 3 days in the conclave of the hands of the cause, hearing all the different views and excitement that they had. Now, I don't know why I ended up being the last person alive that was at that meeting, but I'm still thrilled to be able to talk about what we heard. Not what we said. We were pretty quiet in the meeting of the hands. We didn't have much to say. But they were, at that time, there was the concern about whether we should continue to bring masses into the faith without consolidating them, or whether we had to slow down in order to consolidate the Baha'is so that we'd have something lasting. And this, this developed to the point until after the Hands of the Cause all passed away. Well, Dr. Varga was still with us. He was the last and very dear soul that he became the last hand. Then the House of Justice had to look at a new culture, a culture which would provide a substantial base, so as we attracted new masses to the faith, they'd have some pattern to enter into. And we wouldn't lose them, because we lost in the 1990s, the NSAs were reporting great losses because a generation or two had passed since these mass enrollments, and the new NSAs and the institutions had no formal record of where these believers were at the moment. And this has given birth to the whole idea of core activities and a much tighter knit local basis to the cause of God. So this was the issue and the outcome you are all involved in now in this new developments of the faith. Thank you very much.